So I was debating on which cult to cover next this weekend. While thinking about it, I went to Alpha Force Zero's family's house to help them with some stuff, and I saw my niece there. She's Alpha Force Zero's cousin on her mom's side. They've never really had exposure to Jehovah's Witnesses outside of me, but she started dating a Jehovah's Witness kid a while back, and she's been going to the meetings and actively shunning me. She's like 14. Anyway, she was there and she was refusing to even look at me. At that point, I realized which cult I should focus on for this video. So here's a dissection of part of the November JW Broadcasting episode. Let's get into it.
I'd like to talk about the efforts Jehovah's organization is making to produce literature, publications, articles that are as accurate as possible. Now, when a writer quotes an expert, our researchers will ask, who's this expert? What's his reputation? Is he working for a particular organization? Does this organization have an agenda? Is it a special interest group? If we find that the goals of the organization are questionable, we won't use the quote, even if it's a really good quote.
I think their main goal when deciding who to quote is, will the reader recognize the name? They're trying to get really big names published in their literature at any cost, and they're actually famous for misquoting people. Most famously in the Creation book, also known as Life, How Did It Get Here, by Evolution or by Creation. There are a billion misquotes in this book, and they got in some deep shit for it too. Here are a couple of examples of misquotes. On page 15, paragraph 4, they say, the scientific magazine Discover put the situation this way. Evolution, ... is not only under attack by fundamentalist Christians, but is also being questioned by reputable scientists. Among paleontologists, scientists who study the fossil record, there is growing dissent from the prevailing view of Darwinism. Notice the ellipsis there. When you see that in a Watchtower quote, it means they omitted part of the quote. They say it was because it wasn't relevant to the point. Now let's read the quote in its entirety. Charles Darwin's brilliant theory of evolution, this is where the ellipsis starts, published in 1859, had a stunning impact on scientific and religious thought and forever changed man's perspective of himself. Now that hallowed theory, this is where the ellipsis ends, is not only under attack by fundamentalist Christians, but is also questioned by reputable scientists. Among paleontologists, scientists who study the fossil record, there is growing dissent from the prevailing view of Darwinism. That's blatantly trying to deceive the reader into thinking that evolution is in hot debate among scientists. That's just not the case, and it hasn't been the case in many, many decades. Even at the time of this writing, there was no debate on the fact of evolution among scientists. There might have been debate about the timeline or the long-term progress of evolution, as the scientist is pointing out, but the culmination of the physical processes which, when combined, describe evolution, such as point mutations and natural selection, hasn't been up for debate since long before this article was written. There was dissent long ago, which is part of the scientific method. Now the debate is over. It's a fact now that we've observed it taking place in a lab with our own eyes. No reputable scientist debates that. Let's look at another quote from the same book, page 15, paragraph 6. Paleontologist Niles Eldredge, a prominent evolutionist, said, the doubt that has infiltrated the previous smugly confident certitude of evolutionary biology's last 20 years has inflamed passions. He spoke of the lack of total agreement, even with the warring camps, and added, things really are in an uproar these days. Sometimes it seems as though there are as many variations on each evolutionary theme as there are individual biologists. Now let's look at the real quote. I mention this only to illustrate the lack of total agreement even within the warring camps. Things really are in an uproar these days, and each of the basic ways of looking at evolution has its minor variants. Sometimes it seems as though there are many variations on each theme as there are individual biologists. But that's as it should be. This is how science is supposed to operate. When they, creationists, misrepresent the exuberant creative doubt and controversy permeating evolutionary biology these days, they are actively promoting scientific illiteracy. That is a very different quote from the one given to us by the Watchtower Society. It's like they're trying to intentionally mislead people into thinking evolution is in question, when it very clearly isn't, nor is it being represented that way by the people quoted here. Let's continue.
Now, suppose that a writer wants to quote something from a book. In the reference material, he'll supply a photocopy of the quote in the book, but very often he'll give us 2 or 3 pages before the quote and 2 or 3 pages after as well. And that way, our researchers can examine the quote in context to make sure that what we're saying in print is really what the author of the quote had in mind. For example, an evolutionist might make a statement which, on the surface, appears to confirm his support of creation. Or perhaps an atheist will make a statement that seems to indicate that he believes in God. But when you examine the quote in context, you realize that that isn't what the author had in mind at all. We would never deliberately distort a quotation. We try very hard to use all of our quotations in context.
Oh, sure they do. I just cited 2 quotes that were taken completely out of context. Unintentional? Then why didn't they redact that quote, publicly apologize, and print a second edition with the edits? Those weren't even the only occurrences. There are at the very least 12 instances where they misquoted people in that book. Here's another misquote of Richard Dawkins, a very good author and one of my personal favorites. At this point, a reader may begin to understand Dawkins' comment in the preface to his book, "This book should be read almost as though it were science fiction." And here's what he really said. This book should be read almost as though it were science fiction. It is designed to appeal to the imagination, but it is not science fiction, it is science. Cliché or not, Stranger Than Fiction expresses exactly how I feel about the truth. They just dropped the end of the quote off. He says, "It seems like science fiction, but it isn't science fiction, it's fact." And they took the part that says, "It seems like science fiction." They said they read the entire section before and after the quote they're taking to ensure it's in context. It doesn't feel like they did that on this quote. I have another quote for you, Jehovah's Witnesses. Psalms 14:1. "There is no God." See how easy that was? You can give up on religion now.
Now, it's important to keep up with the very latest research. Something that was stated years ago as a fact may have been disproved. And the reason why is obvious. Someone may spend his entire life researching a very limited point in history, a very small point in history. And of course, if he spends so much time researching, he's going to uncover things. And so it's not surprising that from time to time we have to adjust our view of some historical points. We have to check, check, check. And later on in this discussion, we're going to consider some examples of it. It'll be fun. You'll love it.
I'm going to quote you on that, David. This feels like a nice, clean rationalization for when they get something extremely and embarrassingly wrong.
Now, someone might ask, why is it necessary to be so picky, to be so fussy about accuracy? And an answer I like to give an experience that I heard about a few years ago. In Northern Europe, there was a man who accepted a Bible study from Jehovah's Witnesses. And when he was asked what motivated him to want to study, he said, "I read an article in your Awake magazine on trees." Now, I happen to be a bit of an expert on trees. And after I read the article, I said to myself, that article was so well documented. It was so precise. Any organization that is that careful when writing about trees is going to be just as careful when teaching me the Bible. And on that basis, he accepted a Bible study.
What? Sounds like a logical fallacy to me. Just because somebody is accurate in one area doesn't mean they're accurate in another. And by the way, just a little side note here, accuracy and precision are different in a scientific context. I don't think they've used them incorrectly yet, but I just wanted to point it out. Accuracy is the difference between the measurement and the actual value, and precision is a variation when you measure the same thing repeatedly with the same device. Back to what I was saying. Thinking that they're accurate in one area doesn't mean they're accurate in another. Just look at their ridiculous claims about the Bible. They think some Bible prophecy, which has nothing to do with the end of the world, suddenly has something to do with the end of the world. They had to take verses from Daniel to claim that the world was going to end within a certain number of times, then a verse from Revelation to convert those times into days, then a verse from the book of Numbers to convert those days into years. They're quote mining from 3 different books of the Bible across thousands of years to get a date they were looking for. Why would you think that would be accurate just because some article they wrote about trees had some solid facts in it?
Well, now, how well would you do in spotting a statement that is slightly off and making it more accurate? Would you like to find out? Of course you would. It'll be fun.
I didn't believe you the first time, and I don't believe you now, David. You creepy old f***. Let's do this.
So let's take a quiz that I'll call You Be the Editor. We're going to put a number of statements on the screen, and there's a problem with each one of them. Now, your job is to figure out what's wrong, why it is wrong, and then suggest how to fix it. It's going to be fun. Here's the first statement. According to the Smithsonian Knowledge Encyclopedia, the Egyptian Sphinx was constructed around 2550 BCE. The Egyptian Sphinx was constructed around 2550 BCE.
Okay. He's emphasizing the word Egyptian. Is there something wrong with that? It's from Egypt, isn't it? It is a sphinx, isn't it? What's wrong here? That's definitely the right date.
Well, the problem is with the date, 2550. The global flood occurred about 200 years after that date. So what are the chances that the Sphinx survived the flood? Unless, of course, you think that that's how the Sphinx lost his nose.
That was hilarious. In all seriousness, though, I don't think the Sphinx would have survived the flood. I also don't think tree and plant life would have survived the flood, or viruses, or sea creatures, considering the rain was fresh water, but the ocean was salt water. Basically nothing would have survived in brackish water, which means Noah would have had to have taken sea creatures on his boat too, including blue whales, which are an average of 82 feet for females and 79 feet for males. Good luck fitting a breeding pair on the boat. Are those clean or unclean? Because if they're clean, you need 7. You gonna put them next to the cold environment with the penguins? Don't even get me started on this subject. Let's move on.
Now, these dates are good for you school children to keep in mind when you're writing reports. Sometimes you copy something from an encyclopedia and it gives a certain date, but think about the date of the flood, 2370, so that what you put in your report is as accurate as possible.
What the f***?
Here's one. Let's see if you can spot the error in this one. While most of the early Christians were held in little esteem in the community, a few enjoyed an elevated social status. For example, Luke was a respected physician. Well, the word we need to look at is respected. Now, we respect our doctors today, and our doctors have a very, very fine education. But was that the case in the first century? A reference work says this about first century physicians. Many doctors were freed Greek slaves. Hence, the social standing of doctors was quite low. Because recovery rates were so low, many people were skeptical or even scornful of doctors.
Sure, I understand. That's important. But in scientific papers, we make assumptions as little as possible. We have other scientists try to tear the paper apart. That's the purpose of the scientific method. The scientific method is a crucible in which we burn away irrelevancies and inaccuracies. These examples aren't written like scientific work. Okay, all right. I'll calm down. Let's move on.
See how you do on this one. Imagine the Apostle Paul during his first imprisonment in Rome, writing his letter to the Colossians from a dark prison cell. Well, if you look in the back of the New World Translation, you find that Paul did write his letter to the Colossians in Rome, and he was imprisoned at the time. So what's the problem?
What's the problem? The problem is that you're using the New World Translation for one thing. And the other problem is the fact that you're using the Bible as the basis for determining historical fact. The Bible isn't a good source for historical fact. If it can be verified by at least 2 independent extra-biblical sources, I'll accept it tentatively. That's all I've got for now. I'm planning on addressing more of this video soon because there's so much to address. Anyways, thanks for watching.